I'm Lindsey Colbourne. I'm a visual artist based in Nantperis, near in Eryri in Gwynedd, near at the foot of and here in my studio here, I'm in Dyffryn Peris, which is the valley that runs directly to the north of Snowdon.
Very place specific. Yes, maybe give us some information of what you have been doing before the pandemic.
Yeah, because it's the question I've always dreaded. Like people say, "Oh, you're an artist. What do you make? Do you paint? What do you do?" And I've always been terrible at talking about that. So this is really, to be honest, the first time I've had to talk about it. You know, rather than focusing on creation of objects, my art really is creating sort of spaces within which humans and more than humans can come together to explore something together. And when I first started doing this about 10 years ago, no one really seemed to know what I was trying to do. And I didn't know either, really. But it was building on like 30 years of doing that within, not as an artist, but as in the sort of sphere of conflict resolution and partnership working and so on. And really it's based on the idea that in order to really get a robust grasp of something, you need to have as many perspectives as possible and bring them together to sort of understand the sort of deeper common ground or where these different perspectives create the picture. It's almost like a sort of 3D printer, isn't it? How do all the pieces fit together? Or that classic one where you've got an elephant, if you're just touching the tail, you don't know what it is. If you're just touching the ear, you don't know what it is. And an important part that has come to the fore, and I think this is one of the things that will come through as we're talking about metamorphosis and so on, is this idea of starting from a point of not knowing. And that's important in a way, in that you know that you've got your experience and you know you've got your very situated knowledge, but you don't actually, there's no sort of one given universal truth. So it's about holding that space where you can hear and learn from and change in the space that you create between people and modern humans. And of course I do use you know, some people would say, well, how is what you do different when you're a facilitator? And that's quite hard to answer, except that there's something around the openness of it, and that you're not working to deliver anything in particular, and you're using creative processes often not entirely clearly defined, so there's a lot of room for change and maneuver depending on what those who are taking part might need from the process. But you know, often there's video or installation or photography or something like that goes along with it, or performance, and more focus on those aesthetics perhaps, but really like an embodied aesthetics, like the I found a really interesting quote, see if I can remember it, see it somewhere, by Grant Kester, and he's one of the people who talks about this kind of art, which has got many different, it's actually got names. I didn't know this when I started, but it could be anything from socially engaged art to participatory art or activist art or relational aesthetics, conversational art. Grant Kester calls it relational aesthetics. He says aesthetics is from aesthesis in Greek, which means bodily experience. It doesn't really have much to do with art per se initially. It is only in the 19th century that art gets attached to that concept. The aesthetic really begins as a way to talk about a social exchange, a way of being together that is rooted in the body of the individual. It's kind of, yeah, so there's always a question, where is the art in these things that are mostly in process, but perhaps that starts to answer the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lovely start, and just a few things that I picked up. Maybe we start with a quote, because the quote focuses on the body. And then you use the elephant metaphor and this tactile exploration of an elephant or the body of an elephant, and you touch different tiny parts, but you still don't see it's an elephant. But it's still a physical exploration because the touching requires your hands and it requires the body of the elephant, which is interesting. But then you combine this, this metaphor is so striking because it works for you as this idea of starting what you don't know. Yeah, and of course, with the pandemic, we were in the state now for almost 2 years, and it's ongoing.
For me, it's the pandemic. What that brought to the fore was like a manifestation of the I don't know what the word is, precariousness that we are actually living in very precarious times. I think someone was saying that we've moved from a society of risk to one of uncertainty, and that, to me, that's what the pandemic embodied. It's like it put us all in a thing where we finally noticed that we are in this state of flux, or the idea of linear progress has become revealed, hasn't it, as a lie. I think that's the story we've been told for so long here. I'm talking about here, not all around the world, but here. So that story is taken away. What story do we have now? How do we work our way through these uncertain times and recognize that it will probably always be like this? Like, people talk about the end of the pandemic and 2022, it's going to be so much better. Well, what if we have to live with the situation that things might not be better, especially for those who have got least, who are most going to be affected by all these changes? And I think it's a really big question, and I find it very hard to be I don't know, when people talk about hope and things like that, I think more like Donna Haraway, like, stay with the trouble. How do we stick with it? We know it's always going to be difficult. We don't know where we're going to go, but we need to stick with it anyway.
Yeah. But if your art practice was, and also the way how you think about what art is, was so connected and embedded in physical experience and in the body and embodiment, what did the pandemic and the lockdown mean to that?
Well, it's interesting you say about if it's rooted physically, because I'm not actually sure that before the lockdown it really was. I think that's one of the things that's changed. But obviously, as I decided at the beginning of, the end of 2019, I was going to focus purely on conversation, only on work that connected people to land and connected past, present, future. And I was going to do these one-to-one conversations in this valley here in Dyffryn Peris, and just see where that went with no outcomes. I had embarked on some of that, and I had a few other pieces of work which were around working in communities, looking at the past and future. But they'd all started in the physical world. So by March, they were all sort of little bits. Like, I'd visited, like, one of them was in Newborough, and I'd visited there just to go and meet the people who wanted the work. And I'd been working there for years before, but this was like a new approach to it, where he wanted to look at the creation of the forest there and on the sand dunes. So I did a bit of random filming while I was going around, and then lockdown came, and I couldn't do any of the physical face-to-face contact at all, but they had found 30 hours of interviews, some of which as a result of work I'd been doing before as a conflict resolution there, in English and Welsh. So I was able to then turn the whole project into making some films, and so that was a bit of a lifesaver to begin with, because you don't know what you can do. So there were some physical things like, how do I deliver bits of work? And the conversation one was in a way easier because the valley just went silent and everyone was out walking on the road. You met all the people locally, and everyone was talking now about change. Whereas in the first 3 months of those conversations, people were saying, I've never thought about the future. I've never thought about what big issues like climate change mean here in this place. There was no talk about that. So in a way that was sort of helpful. And then, other ones where we started, how do we do work. We were doing some work in Place Bodva. We were going to do marble mapping of a house, and then we were having some musicians and a poet to come and work with us. Well, they couldn't do that, but we had already done the work in the house. It was literally the day before lockdown. So we turned that into, we made a film, and then we sent it sequentially to the musicians and poet, who then added on top online. So we created the whole thing online. So there's a whole load of physical, how do we get around it like that?
So the work that could go on continued, and it's interesting that, yeah, the pandemic had an impact on how it was delivered and then on the outcome. So kind of the artistic agency, so to speak, of the virus, which is interesting.
Yeah, and the resulting works are all sort of in suspended animation. They exist on the internet, or they've been put on websites, but there's also always a question like, oh, might it one day be really massive in a space where people can physically experience it again, or whatever. And then of course the biggest thing for me in lockdown was just feeling this overwhelming sense that this is, as Arundhati Roy said, this is a portal. Like this is our chance to start to really rethink and move in a different way. And it felt so possible and then so not possible that that then I thought, well, all we can do is create communities of people. I mean, that links, I think, into the resilience side. Like, you know, there was a WhatsApp group set up here to support each other, people who are isolated, and so many people joined that. You could never do anything because there was always 10 or 15 people before you would respond. So you're thinking, how can I be of use in this time? And so that's when I started the Utopia Bach idea. So how do we focus on the bit that we're in, on our Mithia Square, and in just the patch that you're in, with all sorts of relationships and entanglements, humans and more than humans. Mm-hmm. How can that feel enough in the face of this global narrative of now it's a crisis and now we need all these technological fixes? And, you know, and then just listening to people like my godson Grip, who was saying he just felt hopeless, except when he makes miniature bonsai gardens. And then meeting Samina by accident in a barn. And she said, oh, could you help me make miniature scenes with slate? I was like, oh, there's something in miniaturizing something that might be appropriate to these times, because our lives have miniaturized, haven't we? And our body is the measure of a miniature. I mean, that's, I think that
the idea of scale. Yeah.
But I don't think I had a really physical practice before. Did I do performances? A tiny bit of performance, but more as me there enabling a conversation, perhaps doing a few things, but not like really with attention on me as a physical, or my body as an actual thing. That I think only came out in lockdown, as the physical became more and more of an issue. As you disappeared into this virtual world, it became more and more issue, didn't it?
It's very interesting, because when listening to you, it's less about kind of very individual or subjective concerns you engage with, but it's a bit like, you know, you're looking around, you know, what happens in your community, what happens in the world, and then you start engaging with kind of a very common and shared experience, and then this is what you try to explore a bit more.
So for me, things only become real in interaction with others, and that I think that's the heart of my practice, isn't it? So
I mean, because you said most of your work emerges from conversations or interaction with other people, be it artists or non-artists. And conversations, you know, can happen online. You don't need to be in the same room. So I was just wondering, do you think that if conversations happen in the same room or in the same place, having the same food, you know, kind of sharing more than just ideas, that it triggers, I don't know, different things in you?
is strange, isn't it? Because you're constantly having eye contact. You know, in real life, we wouldn't be doing this. We'll be looking at other things between us, wouldn't we? So in that way, there's an intensity of the engagement online which you don't get in the real world. And in fact, I was quite surprised by that. Like in Utopia's Bach, when we need to have a focused meeting, I prefer that to be on Zoom. So it's like, it's kind of, you get things done, but you don't really do so much of the building the relationships between you. So we did manage in Utopia's Bach to build a new community through Zoom initially, but we did know some of us at the beginning. I think it'd be very hard to build relationships from scratch just online.
Because you've talked a lot about Utopia's Bach already, can you tell us a bit more about what is Utopia's Bach?
Yeah, that is a good question. It's called Utopia's Bach, Revolution in Miniature. And utopias, I guess the idea of utopia, it's associated with all sorts of things that could be extremely problematic. You know, big, you know, single person thought through ideas, usually quite draconian. This is the way to live, usually coming with strong moral and situated sort of norms, and it has been associated, I think, is associated with the Enlightenment in particular, isn't it? And that, you know, supremacy kind of stuff. And so what is it to twin that with the word Bach, which is, and this is thanks to Hugh Jones, who helped work all this out. So Bach, and literally you could just say small, but also it means nook, and a sort of more prescribed space, and also links, it's also a term of endearment. So it's a sort of a small thing, a small dear thing. So it changes, if you put the two words together, they're kind of like a juxtaposition, but so the idea is, well, it comes from thinking, can we imagine the world can we imagine the world differently just by thinking small scales? Or could we try, what could we try out on the smallest possible scale that would help us to rethink our relationship with the future, particularly thinking from or working with people who are going to be most affected by these changes. So the idea is that we create a community, just bring people together who might be interested in the idea, and that's what we've been doing since, well, I don't know, when was it? October 2020, probably. Yeah, and gradually build a community through that. So do it through discussion and work out together, what could we do with this idea? So Utopia's Bach now is a network, well, it's a website where we try and hold everything together. And then we have a core group of people who are sort of coming together every month to explore questions around Utopia's Bach. And then some people are also doing community, what we call them experiments, because it's all based on not knowing and taking risks, like exploring what are these small gestures that we could make, working with different people and offering voices that quite often aren't heard in the mainstream, because it's the mainstream that's blinkering our ability to think of how to be different in this world. So it's kind of a complicated project. And we did get Arts Council funding for it after 6 months, which was amazing. And it's Arts Council funding where they don't need any outcomes. So that's supported us to actually pay people for their time. And thank goodness for that, because people have put a lot of time and effort into it.
Kind of this idea of miniature, and also a bit with Utopia's Bach, this contraception, also localizing the activity and the community. It suits the pandemic very well, doesn't it? You have small groups. We had this 5-mile limit.
Yeah.
And I remember that one summer. And also the Metamorphosis festival, was, particularly designed for encounters within small audiences and with, only a few participants. So what made you engage with the Metamorphosis Festival?
Well, of course, the primary reason was because the surrealist safari was so amazing in lockdown. And, well, I mean, to be fair, your ability to bring things together and hold that space by dealing with all the hideous logistics and risk around the pandemic, but then bringing together a whole creative community who are going to create this festival where the sum is going to be greater than the parts, because the parts are all going to be so small, but in collectively. And I remember, you know, you would be looking at one thing and realizing how many connections there are between that and what someone else is doing from a really different, you know, type of creative practice or focus or location. These sort of common themes were going through them. And it just felt like such an important milestone, because we're all working away on doing these things, but like, where does it, you know, how does it become real? And Metamorphosis was a place, like, for example, Utopia's Bach, until Metamorphosis, we had never met in person. That was where we were able to meet in person. And that was where we were able to bring things we'd made. And it also created a bit of a focus to actually get things done. Because I think one of the things in the pandemic, it became really difficult to get things done. Weirdly, because you had a lot of time, but it just all sort of disappeared in this very strange, and partly anxiety, I think, and partly, you know, why did it matter? So you gave us a place to come together, a place to be creative. And it was almost like, you know, those schemes where you have helping mothers back to work or whatever. It's like that. We've all got afraid. So.
You would say that the Metamorphosis really had an impact on how Utopia's Bach developed, or is developing?
Yeah, very much so. And I think the idea of having lots of dispersed different things going on, adding up to the whole, and you don't have to be involved in all the different bits. Yeah, that's very much influenced the approach of that, both in terms of the project as a whole, but also thinking of how we do our events. Yeah, and dispersing over time. That's the other thing you did, is dispersing over time. And our geocache was over a weekend, so people were dropping in and out rather than a big load of people at once. And actually, it's like having a protracted party rather than a one-night party. So you actually get to talk to everyone and have interactions and, you know, deepen things and have time to reflect and consider things rather than just rushing around ticking boxes of numbers. And also, sorry, one other thing is the pandemic, and as we came out and all sorts of things were unlocking, the art sector, I mean, it just kind of absented the space. And in a way that's good, because then you get things like Metamorphosis come up. They sort of grow more organically, don't they? But it filled that gap that the art world had left wide open, I think.
So they kind of also kept the audiences warm for the, I don't know, large scale creative industries, because that's one of the challenges the creative industries are facing now, bringing the audiences back.
Yeah, and I think it's, well, because they're all fixed with, I mean, one of their big problems is they're so attached to buildings. I mean, is that not part of the problem that we're in the whole world? You know, we're so attached to property and ownership and servicing that and making money through that they can't be fleet of foot.
So do you think that with the Metamorphosis Festival, you also learned to love to diversify the usage of places and maybe designing something very site-specific, or has it been a practice you followed already before the pandemic?
Yes, my practice is site-specific entirely. And I performed before the pandemic in woods and barns, or held events in woods and barns, and only unwillingly would I be in an art gallery, to be honest. But I think what was different about Metamorphosis is that it was even more like that. It was even more like, oh, let's just go to this bit of woodland and I don't know, and wander around. There's no, it felt much more, or go to Bangor High Street and perform there. So it's much more like we sort of popped up within everyday life, sort of adding, I think, to it made the physical presence of us in those places became so massively surprising, I think, that it meant that you could go to places where before you might have been lost or no one would have been interested. But, before you publicize and put signs up and it's all, but this was much more spontaneous, wasn't it? And
well, that's an interesting observation. It might be, do you think it might be related to, the unreality of bodies? That for us, bodies became during the pandemic something really unreal and only virtual. So whenever, you encounter a body, a physical presence out there, you take notice of it, either even as a risk, or don't come too close.
Yeah.
Or something. So yeah, that I don't know, that people were more sensitive.
Yeah.
Possible.
Yeah, because I think risk was associated with other bodies, and there was a lot of chat. People would often be talking about their recent trip out and how people were insensitive around the supermarket, and they were or were not wearing a mask. I mean, now we all have a mask, wherever we are. Are they, were they wearing a mask and did they come close? And this negotiation of personal space, it became, in my mind, you sort of notice who's being most careful, and then you go there. So it's kind of a new negotiation of that physical space. And I think what we were doing in some of the performances is we weren't entering people's physical space, but it was so obvious that people were doing something odd with their bodies on top of all the oddness around bodies, that it became a big thing. And I mean, that Chromecast performance in the High Street, like, I sort of expected everyone would just keep away and be, but it wasn't like that at all. I mean, we were giving things out. I thought no one would want to take anything, but it was almost like, because we were weird, because it was so out there, it was almost like a relief. It's like, oh yeah, something outside all these restrictions. And the only reason we could do that is because the Metamorphosis Festival, as in you really, was holding the health and safety and logistics of all of that. Without that framework, I would never have felt able to do that, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. But that's also interesting. That was an idea you expressed earlier, that the festival caused you to, direct all your efforts and creativity into something that could become real. So kind of complete freedom is never really healthy to the arts. You kind of need a framework, you need certain restrictions, because there are a bit the world where you then embed the artwork.
I think art can flourish either with constraints or without any, to be fair. Because without any, you work out your own. And that's a process that's in a way sort of deeper, isn't it? Because you have to focus yourself somewhere. But the pandemic, I mean, things like the, when we did the Chromecast on the beach, when we did Hagira, and we're thinking about audience, you're saying, yeah, what about the audience? And then the idea of, watching through binoculars was a brilliant sort of, I mean, it wasn't a piss take of the regulations, but it changes the aesthetics of the event, it changes the nature of it, it makes it more of a spectacle, and it encourages thinking about that, the distance that we need, that we now require to be safe, doesn't it? So those restrictions then come up with more creativity, yes.
I think the idea with the spectacles is also interesting, because it's a one-sided zooming, isn't it? So in Zoom, of course, we are like using, technology as spectacles, but it's on both ends. So you see me close up as well as I do see you close up. But with the Chromecast on the beach, it was only the spectators who could zoom into you, have this really close up view.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, you had no control on this. And also you were not necessarily aware of the audience.
No, we were only aware of the flipping wind. But that in a way, it's like, in a way, the whole idea of it is so powerful, and it genuinely felt like a struggle to be able to walk in that, you know, in our outfits and the wind, and we were just struggling to survive, or like trying to travel, and the idea that people might just have been standing there watching us. I mean, in a way, you know, like without helping, not that we needed help really necessarily, but it really brings that to the fore, doesn't it? It's like who's struggling where. But
I thought your comment on fighting the winds with Chromecast on the beach is also interesting, because I remember when organizing these two Chromecast on the beach events, we were looking into the weather forecast, and, you know, like for weeks, you know, but it was permanently changing. And that's, again, this idea of uncertainty, isn't it? Even with the weather.
Yeah. Well, that's a very good point. And, you know, I think originally we were just thinking it's going to be beautiful and serene. And then we were there at the first take of it. And I mean, it was just unbelievably cold and raining. And we have got these huge things on our heads. It's really heavy, and we're all quite old.
But the weather gave it something sublime and wild.
Yeah.
And yeah, a bit. Yeah, and well, the weather made the performance, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think the weather was a collaborator. It was part of Chromecast. I was reading a book. It was saying, oh, crone weather, hag weather, and then described exactly the weather we're in. So that was one of our collaborators. You know, it was there.
Which is very interesting. So we did these two Chromecasts on the beach, and then afterwards you discovered that crone weather is, how does this, because I've got these moments again and again where just, and I wonder, and it creates, I don't know, it creates a sensation that that lacks word on my side. So I don't have a word to describe the sensation. I often call it bliss. Yeah, but I think that's not what it is.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of the philosophers talk about being in the flow state, where basically everything is coming together because you're in this flow state, and it's not even necessarily a rational mind thing, but everything is coming together. I mean, partly because you've done so much behind the scenes, everything just suddenly flows. Yeah, everything all fits. And I mean, that also happened with Utopia's Bach in a way, because, as you said, because it came from lockdown, it fits with it. And in lockdown, I suppose we thought it wasn't going to last very long. But of course, it's going to last kind of almost forever. And so then, you know, others like, Wales Arts International come out with this whole thing around Petha Bychain, which is a saying from St. David, do the small things. And then these things just connect to more and more, and they grow momentum, don't they? I don't think they need to get big, but they just, in that flow state, they're just connecting to some kind of zeitgeist or each other. And in a way, that's what Metamorphosis did, didn't it? It's like we each came up with all these different ideas, but then somehow they all were just really united, actually, with the name Metamorphosis, because that's what it felt like, isn't it? We were emerging from that pupa into all sorts of weird and wonderful forms.
These post-event discoveries, like crone weather, for me, it has something, I don't know, almost spiritual, where I think, okay, I now know what I did was true, and real, you know, it's real.
Yeah, and looking up, Vanda and I, you know, making the Hegira film, looking up words around journey and pilgrimage, and there's a word, Hegira, which is originally a religious term, but actually, and from Middle East, but then has been taken in the 15th century to UK and turned into this mammoth search. And just reading that word, it's like it just completely encompasses this, which is, and it's a beautiful word. So just changing one letter to hag rather than heg, but yeah, it felt really good. It's like yeah, others have been here too. You know, this is a thing.
Yeah. But that's what I do all the time. So you've got Hack, which, you know, brings in this journey idea. But of course, you can deviate it from Hack if you just give Hack an English pronunciation. And then, so this is how I work. This is how I bring these three languages together, kind of in how I do this etymological explorations, and then linking them just by pronunciation, homophony, and
well, I think it's great, isn't it? Because of course, well, as the post-structuralists would say, the language is constraining how we see the world, isn't it? So if you're playing with that and doing it with more than one at once, it's got to be freeing. And you see, maybe that's what you're doing, making these little wormholes of, in the fabric of the grip of mainstream society.
Also, Phonecast is something you engaged with already before the pandemic.
No, this is something that came out of lockdown, where we'd all been having those intimate relationships with our place. And I think the aspect of rural in this whole metamorphosis thing might be quite important. But I think it was happening in cities, or with the spiders in your room or whatever. I think we were all connecting to other living beings in a deeper way. So it's exploring aging, power, identity, eccentricity, and how we engage with the more than human in this sort of process of becoming old. And at the same time, what the role of that is in the precariousness of our times now. So again, in that same book that talked about Hag, whether it's saying about the role of the crone in doing that, in holding that kind of space, in transition and so on. So it's about exploring all of that. And it was like the first performance we did was in Serena Safari. And we follow a sort of, a bit like when you watch the starlings migrating, we try and have a few sort of rules that we follow, but we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Like we huddle if we don't know what we're doing. We decide on a particular type of sounds or something we're going to explore. Just a few simple things like that, and then that holds us together. And at the first performance, it was really surprising how releasing it was. So we had our socially distanced outfits for, they're created for the pandemic. And I made mine out of fencing wire, which I've worked with for a long time as a sort of metaphor for enclosure and ownership and control of land or loss of land, but actually being inside the wire, but then being freed of all of that constraint feels quite good. So we had these outfits on, and when we started, I thought, what are we going to, how are we going to do this? Like, why are people going to follow us? And so, but follow they did, and surprisingly. And then you just get lost in the performance with masks on, because I have a mask on mine, and there's something about the freedom of it and having the mask on and the weirdness of it that makes me feel like a warrior. I just feel completely released. I mean, I have actually attached to myself some of the sayings that I had when I was a child. So, don't draw attention to yourself, put others first, and all sorts of ones which are all designed to make you hidden, but also about delivery. Like, if you want a job doing well, do it yourself, and don't make a fuss. All those sorts of things which actually have sort of overridden my life, I think. So it's just like a huge release for some reason. And I think it's about putting yourself out there physically, and you can't really hide, and we haven't really got like something that's going to distract anyone from what we're doing. We're just there. And of course, because we're in a pack, like the one in Bangor High Street, when we went there, it just made me really think of Westerns, cowboys going into town and their dust balls rolling, and going in there in a line. I just, with our water water sprays and our cake as our guns, it just felt kind of transformational in a way somehow. Yeah.
thing. And it's also nice that you use the word warrior and not soldat.
Soldier.
Soldier.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, not.
Yeah, because the soldier is, one who belongs in an army and follows instructions and commands, but the warrior.
Warrior never actually does anything in my mind. They're just an image, aren't they?
Do you want to show us? Because I see your head thing in the background. Do you want to show us some of the Chromecast of your Chromecast?
Oh yeah. Well, as you can see in my studio, I just gather dead things mostly from around here. So everything's been found around here. These are all from my Mixtia Square. And in fact, the main structure of it and the metal that's coming up here were actually the first thing I ever made when I decided to become an artist. So it's got many years of stuff in there. And yeah, it's a lot of rhizomes, so bracken rhizomes as well.
Mm.
So rhizomes seem quite important for the future somehow.
Mm.
And wood and a lot of stitching. So one of the things I did in lockdown is I got quite obsessed with podcasts, but it's really nice to do something. So I started doing what I very first started doing, which was wrapping fencing wire, like on a major scale that was, but this is on a smaller scale, but just wrapping the bits of wire. So it's kind of, I don't know, it's got a lot of women's work in there, as well as looking quite, because it comes down over my face like this, looking warrior-y.
Did you feel, I mean, these costumes, they put you into a different reality that normally wouldn't belong to High Street.
Yeah.
Wouldn't belong there. So in regard to, I know, bringing your body into the public and engaging in the public, does it, I don't really know where I don't really have a question, but it's more, does this trigger some thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting because the High Street performance, it was almost like we were reanimating a dead space. And in fact, you can hear your comment behind saying, oh, do you think Bangor High Street's going through its menopause? And I think there is something about that. But again, I'm sort of saying, actually, this change of any kind is an opportunity in some way, isn't it? Like, there's always something that can come through. So it felt like, yeah, that we were, in a way, being welcomed by people who are not people who would be, I don't think we would have had any interaction with any of them if we were in a theatre. I'm pretty sure they wouldn't be going to something like the theatre. But they were taking things from us, they were commenting on us, saying that we'd made their day and all sorts of stuff. And I think the weirdness of the physical presence there encouraged interaction. I mean, Lisa did say she thought some people would go round us, try to avoid us. And you can see some of that in the film, but mostly you can see people being interested or engaging. And then the little girls in the playground, you can hear them scream, come and have a look at this. And we're all, sort of delighted by the possibility that you can behave in this way after all these rules, and what can you do and what not do, and everyone being a bit afraid of each other. So, yeah. And someone did say, oh, well, older women just don't care anymore, so they can do anything they like. It's like, well, yeah, that is the case. But that isn't what is generally thought of, isn't it? Older women, you become invisible. And I know Randa's worked a lot on that. I mean, for me, I found it personally a joy to become invisible or less visible. But I think as part of lockdown, one of the things I really learned is I just feel freer to mess things up. I mean, what if it's just, this, I could just be awful. I mean, I don't need to be special or deliver anything or be safe or be over prepared anymore. I feel like a lot of that stuff's sort of gone. It's like, that's all part of the old world. Like anything that changes our relationship with productivity is good.
It's very interesting because of course I've got I can't even express the respect I have for, this large scale professional theater productions or performances, where, you need to orchestra, or you've got an orchestra of 200 people, bringing their skills together for this perfect performance. But on the other hand, it also is a very safe space, isn't it? Because it is so professional, and it, creates a very, kind of an illusion that it's perfect. Whereas, if you've got this more high risk, well, it is professional as well in its approach, but things that appear a bit more raw and allow more chance, be triggered also by agencies we haven't, like the weather, the agency of the weather, allowing this is way more risky than, of course, it's financially, it's more risky to have a, 500,000 budget theater performance to fail. Yeah, but yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think for me, it's about creating the conditions for emergence, which I'm quoting that from Tyson Younger Porter. It's actually that's what we need to learn to do. So, I mean, the first performance I ever did was National Theatre Wales. Well, Simon Coates at National Theatre Wales sort of supported me to develop the first performance and he was like, you need to put yourself in here. I was trying to not be there, but he's like, just be yourself. And we combined an archaeological dig with a supper in a barn and impromptu bits of performance that we did as part of the conversation around that dinner table. And it was completely different to how we'd anticipated it. But then why would you want to reproduce it? Why would you can't really, where would the energy be there for another sort of performance of this, to roll it out, to go to different places? It is situated in the barn just there. And also the bits that were best were the bits that spontaneously came out, when you create those conditions. So I think that, the improvised theatre side of things exists out there, doesn't it? And you can combine improvised theatre in a theatre, but it is much more risk averse and controlled. And I think the question of what are the smallest sets of constraints or rules that create the conditions for emergence is a really interesting question.
So it's like a school for resilience, isn't it? This very less scripted, open formats, allowing non-human agency.
Okay, yeah, creating space for that, or that there is a space for that within, for the more, there's a space for the more than human in there. And sometimes, sometimes it just invites itself in anyway, which is a joy, isn't it? But yeah.
Good. Thank you. Is there any other thoughts you want to share?
I do wonder about if there's something around rural.
Oh yeah, I made a note about this.
Someone asked us in an interview about Utopia's back. It was an example of art in a rural area, and their definition of rural was like, we don't feel that at all. It's like isolated and not much going on, and culturally a bit backward or whatever. But obviously in Wales there's a big tradition of things being dispersed. So have the Mari Lwyd rather than the maypole, where the Mari Lwyd goes round to different people's houses rather than coming together as a village. It's not even a country of towns, is it? It's a country of villages, really. There's a couple of cities now, but so I think Metamorphosis in that that the context within which it's taking place is quite important, because in a way we're used to coming to disperse things, because that's how how life works up here, isn't it?
Mm.
But also I think it illustrates or makes visible what is otherwise quite hidden. So I invited the people who own the holiday home next door, she's an artist in London, to come along to it. And she was blown away. She's like, because they're always saying, oh, well, we couldn't leave London because of the culture, and there won't be any culture in rural areas. It's like, I think it's really important to illustrate that there's just a massive cultural activity going on up here.
Yeah. And it's very experimental. It is avant-garde. So it's not folklore. It is also folklore. There is folklore, yes, of course.
Yeah.
It needs to be, but it is as diverse as you've got it in Metropolitans, even more diverse, because when you work under the radar of the arts market, you are less at risk to, I don't know, jump on running trains or something. And you've got more time to,
Yeah. And then it's interesting, isn't it, that because it's on the cutting edge, of course, new ideas always come from them outside the mainstream. And that's also what's happened actually in this year, is that the mainstream art world has gone, this is doing this kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting, so you sort of feel, oh, that's nice, you're being recognized. And part is like, but could you just keep away a bit? Because we want to keep on that edge, don't we? And I think if you're in a city, perhaps that pull is stronger because you're nearer the sort of highfalutin events and the networking and the big names. I don't know.
No, it is a good, I mean, I have been questioning this idea of the avant-garde as only being a phenomena of metropolis.
Oh, yeah.
Because
they say it of psychogeography as well, don't they?
Yeah. And because so many avant-garde artists like Dieter Roth, he worked in Iceland. He worked in Iceland.
Yeah.
And Kurt Schwitters, he worked in the Lake District. So, they all went to very rural areas. And as you so rightly said, where you don't have a mainstream, where you can really explore and, but of course, they're always fed into metropolitan cultures as well, where it then maybe gained momentum and became visible. But it was already happening under the radar in the rural and less urban places, so-called margins. Interesting. Okay.
Okay, I think that's it, really.
Good.